Welcome back, you hear of Goldberg. Today we'll be talking about women, labor, and capitalism. It's an immensely important subject because all too often the manosphere will propose these economic ideas without bothering to follow through and see the end results. How is this going to impact existing social power dynamics or relationships? The typical manospherian is going to be a conservative or libertarian. Oh, we need less regulation, a free market, then men will have great jobs and women will know their place. If only it were that simple. And so what we're going to do is consider a broad history of the labor movement and then go into exactly how economic freedoms have contributed to the feminism of today. Feminism is not some bogeyman that just came down from the mountain in the 1960s. It only exists if you have certain options for people. All right, so let's just delve in. If you look at the Native Americans, especially pre-European or early stage of Europeans, the men did almost nothing in the way of running the economy. It was almost entirely women. They did the agriculture and they produced clothes and other goods. Men did hunt and they would fight, but when they captured people, made them slaves, because by the way, the Native Americans were pretty much the model if you wanted to be a slaver. They had a massive slave trade. To emasculate their male captives, they would say you have to work with the women. And this changed, especially as the Europeans started consolidating more power, 17 and 1800s. Even though women had a lot of authority within the tribal structure, the men began usurping more, and there were conflicts because they were saying, look, this is how it's worked for so many years, why are you changing it? It became a little bit more patriarchal, probably because of the influence of the Europeans over time. One might point to the Crusades as well, maybe not as much of a staple of society, but as some guys gave up their hoe or their shovel and went to fight in the Middle East, women, it was either women or it was teenagers or older people were running the farms. So this is something you don't hear too much about. People just want to see black or white, the main story, and they're not interested in history, especially that type of, what happened. If you've ever seen Downton Abbey, which of course is based on the whole landed gentry or tenant farmer model that was in the United Kingdom and also other nations, a lot of people in the manosphere have this idea that back in the good old days, you had a submissive wife at home and the man worked, and that's just how it was. Of course, this is nonsensical. You look at Downton Abbey, you have the woman of the manor, and she wears nice dresses, she's feminine, she entertains people. Then you've got these girls, the housekeeper, the maids, the ones who do the cooking, scrub the floors, change the bed sheets. So it's not so much, oh, that's just how it was. It was based upon where you stood in society. And because while you had a certain level of capitalism back then, there were less opportunities, that meant that many of these women might have been a maid their entire life. Maybe they moved up to be housekeeper, but there wasn't a whole lot of climbing the class ladder in the same way. Of course, during these periods, even as women started becoming more integrated with the workforce, 17 and 1800s, it was common for the family to take all their earnings. And this is a very important point that we're going to get more into depth with as we go on in the video. But they were working. They were not all just sitting at home being nice, cleaning a little bit. No, many of them were actually working for other people. And you start to see this. Even as slavery is ended, you've got what's the stereotype of the black woman who works as a maid for the white lady in the South. One of the reasons why, as industrialization picks up, women were favored in some cases, especially textile factories, is because they were cheaper, just like children were cheaper. And I think it was Murray Rothbard, the libertarian economist, who said that women, or rather parents, should be allowed to sell their children because it's good for the economy, brah. Just saying, Now, as far as organized labor is concerned, this is really fascinating. Contrary to what you might believe, the early labor movement was not exactly feminist or, SJW. They didn't want women in the labor unions. You had the 1901 printer strike in France, and the union guys got pissed off because what do the companies do? They brought in what are called blackleggers or strike breakers who were predominantly women. James Connolly, who was one of the earlier union leaders in Europe, he said that divorce was a creation of capitalism. This is kind of interesting. You wouldn't necessarily think that way. In 1909, there was like a march of 20,000 women for organized labor. But yeah, there was that early conflict, and I always find it kind of hilarious because the guys, the manosphere who say they're libertarian or pro-capitalism, will make claims like, if women weren't in the workforce, men would have higher wages. Well, yeah, actually, you'd probably have a labor shortage if you had no women in the workforce, nowadays at least. The point being, if you truly are a capitalist, if women are cheaper to employ at that time, you'd be like, hell yeah, let's do it, because it means lower overhead costs, we can provide goods at a cheaper rate, so everyone benefits, supposedly. Just like with migration. This is not my opinion, I'm just trying to make you be logical if you believe in capitalism. If Jose doesn't want welfare and he just wants a job, he's not like a criminal, you should not support a border wall or immigration controls, because people like that, economic migrants, you'd say, well, yeah, he's going to help the company save money. He's going to take less money than an American. That's what a genuine capitalist believes. It is free movement of goods, people, labor, services. The EU is trying to achieve that slowly but steadily. Of course, it's difficult due to the nature of the European economy. There was also, of course, the big Triangle factory fire, textiles that killed almost predominantly women. So my point is, they were part of the labor force. You can't just dismiss that because it doesn't go along with your narrative of, oh yeah, they were all staying at home and being feminine. It really depends on, again, what class you belong to in society at that given period in history. And obviously in the World War II especially, many of them were staffing factories, building things for the war, supplies, weaponry, and the like. Now, of course, when we get to the 1950s, or really even the late 40s, men come back from the war, there's a decent manufacturing economy, especially in the United States. Many guys move into that. So women are less likely to be as big of a presence in the workforce as they were during the conflict. However, that did not stop a lot of women from still getting jobs, because the stat is, I believe, 1/3 or so of women were working even during the 1950s. And some of it was, you take the whole like leave it to beaver idea of the woman just being at home. Some of these women, they got a job as a receptionist or a secretary even part-time because they wanted to help out their husband with the bills, or they wanted some disposable income. Very important point there. I think it's funny too, because I've noticed from the Ibmore or Sissy Black Man guys, they'll kind of simp for the 1950s. I guess they imagine themselves like, oh yeah, you know, my grandpappy was sitting there. Of course, don't date black women. That's the Sissy Black Man argument. So they'd have their like white or Asian wife being feminine in the kitchen. It's like, I don't think you really understand the social relations going on back then. Just saying, you know. But yeah, there's this kind of laudatory nostalgia for the 1950s as though it was, you know, ideal. And even if you just look at it from the economic standpoint, again, it depends on what class you belong to. If you're working class, there's a good chance the woman's going to have to go get a job. If there are restrictions on who can get work in a particular area, yeah, that's why you might have, again, the black woman might be working as a servant for a richer person. You might have, like, an Italian guy being a chauffeur for a rich Care Bear. It's not the case that, oh yeah, everyone's just living this perfect apple pie life where he works at the factory and she just stays at home being feminine. That's really just a massive illusion, okay? And ultimately, when we consider the influence of capitalism, why was it so significant in the growth of feminism? Well, for the simple fact that when women began to get economically emancipated, when they could earn their own money, they could buy their own stuff, this is what really destroyed any semblance of the traditional family structure. Because if you're not reliant on your daddy for money and you're not reliant on your husband, you're going to start saying, well, first of all, I don't have to listen. Second of all, I'm going to have much higher standards. Think of Milton Friedman, freedom to choose, right? Consider it for a second. If you're talking about a guy in the 1950s, he makes the equivalent of, 50 grand, maybe has a decent factory job, inflation adjusted. He's 5'7", average face. Well, he's not a Chad. Right, but he's got an income. He's going to take care of you. You know that you can't wait until you're 35 and just find some sucker. That was then. In the 60s and 70s especially, they start getting more education, they go into the professional world. Well, all of a sudden, they're making decent money themselves. So if a woman today is making, I don't know, 60, 70 grand in the modern age, and you're making 75 or 80 grand, well, she might say, sorry, but you need to be making more like 140. You have to have something way above because I'm not going to settle for average. You got to be over 6 feet. You got to have a decent face. You got to have a nice body. You got to be, built up. Their standards are going to rise. Now, obviously, part of it is technology, but you can't take away the fact that women having the ability to make their own economic decisions, to earn their own money, to live by themselves, all these things have contributed to the ridiculous, skyrocketing sense of standards in dating and marriage. And what I don't understand is when the manosphere keeps shilling for capitalism all the time and then complains when capitalism creates this state of affairs. Yeah, you could say, well, no, women are just dependent on the government. That works for working class women, the welfare argument. It does not work for middle class women because if you're making today as a woman 80 or 90 grand, you're probably not getting any welfare from the government because you're not qualifying unless you're scamming the system. So it really just goes to show you how relevant this happens to be. And so you almost need to violate your capitalist ideals and take women out of the workforce entirely in order to go back to this nice system where average guys can have a monogamous marriage, so-called. If you don't believe the relevance of this, consider companies like Ulta Beauty or Sephora. I mean, how well they've done. Do you think that would have occurred if men were still the primary breadwinners in the household? Probably not, or not at the same scale, because unless dude's a total simp, he's going to say, I might buy you like a new outfit every year. That's what people did in the old days. Unless you were super rich, you didn't have a wardrobe of clothes and shoes and outfits like most women do. You basically had a couple and maybe one nice, but you didn't have all this extravagance. But this is the, every man a king, capitalism, cheap credit, that sort of dynamic. Well, there are consequences. It doesn't mean you have to abolish capitalism, but you as a man need to start saying, okay, I've advocated this, now I'm going to live with the consequences in large part. And that's the other funny part. They talk about all this competition in the free market, but then they complain when they have to compete in a very high-stakes dating market. You think they'd say, no, I'm going to be the best guy ever. I'm going to do my clown game, and I'm going to get these women because I'm better than all these other suckers who are lazy, who don't want to work hard like they do in the economy. I mean, it's a little facetious, but it's kind of true at the same time. Point being, what you advocate for has consequences. You're not going to have a perfect, wonderful capitalist model and then you can just shut out 50% of the population because you don't like them, having their own sense of what they want to purchase, what they want to desire. I don't agree with it, mind you. I don't like how the whole system functions, but I also recognize where it comes from. If women are dependent on their father or their husband for money, they're less likely overall to be suffragettes. They're less likely to be the angry feminist who's screaming that men need to die and, oh, I'm so independent. And the only thing I could see really changing this in the near term, if in fact, which I'm skeptical, but if in fact the automation is as bad as some claim, it might be the case that less women will be able to get employed. However, if they do basic income, it's not going to really matter. So my point being, what you believe in economically, that translates into the social realm. Feminism is a direct byproduct of the economic emancipation of women. And even if you said, well, we could have, this capitalism, but then, fathers should just keep the money that their daughters make, or husbands should just keep the money their wives make. But there's always going to be those guys who say, I don't agree with that. And if enough of those people do that, enough of those guys say, no, it's your money, you keep it, well, you're going to be in the same situation in a short period of time. So just pay attention to what you believe in and consider the consequences down the road.